Welcome to UCL Lunch Hour Lectures. Today, the guest speaker is Dr. Federico Federici, that is Associate Professor in Translation Studies at the Center for Translation Studies at UCL. Federico is analyzing a topic that is of incredible interest for disaster management, because he's trying to understand the role of translation in crisis, not just in disasters, in crisis. Each one of us experienced something like that in our life, even just while we went on holiday somewhere, the time where we were there and we were maybe having an headache and we were not understanding how to relate with the pharmacist, or the time we were maybe in a nice seaside and we actually didn't know if the weather was going too bad, what we had to do, and how to communicate it with the local authorities. So Federico is doing this great job that is trying to improve our understanding of crisis communication and how translation and the role of culture is going to that. He founded, here it is, the guest speaker, by the way, welcome. He founded the Center for Translation Study at Darwin University. He led it, and now is publishing international journals such as the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, and is leading a guest special issue in the Journal of Disaster Prevention and Management. As I said, his research focuses on the role of translation in crisis, and is member of different international European projects, and here is him, and I hope you will have a nice time and you will find as much interesting the topic as much as I find it.
So, thank you for your patience. Please switch on your mobile phone. There's an element of interactivity, not that it's going to interfere too much with what I would like to tell you about the research that I'm carrying out. And the title, of course, is just a reference to "we don't need no education." That's obvious. But "we don't need no translator" is a concept that is more widely spread than you would imagine in terms of risk communication in multilingual crisis. There seems to be a perception that whatever language is your first and main language, you'll be able to get understood in case of a crisis if somebody else uses one of the world lingua francas, those being English, Arabic, Spanish, Indo, depending on the geographical area. The fact is that it's slightly different, and the reality is different a lot compared to this assumption. So I'd like to know from you if you speak other languages, and that is very important for me to test you later on during the lecture. Anybody who is not a native speaker of English? Okay, quite a large number of you. Anybody who is a native speaker of Spanish? I might need your help later on. What I intend to do is to look at three aspects of risk communication and language. I would like to persuade you that language translation matters in crisis, and I would like to show with a few examples, also including some elements from our research, that understanding information is crucial to act. Okay, you would say, that's a banality, Federico. We've been waiting for you for 10 minutes to arrive and you're going to tell us that. Yeah, but it's not so banal when we're talking about being prepared and being ready to face a multilingual crisis. And ultimately, I'd like to show you some of the interest from international organizations in terms of communicating risk in multilingual crisis, presenting you the results of a report that's going to be published at the end of this week. So something familiar and at the same time unknown. Adesso formate due file ordinate, fissate la porta sul retro a destra e quella a sinistra. Poi raggiungete il punto di raccolta esterno. Dal punto di raccolta di sicurezza, per favore, raggiungete la zona di sicurezza della strada. You're all okay, aren't you? You're safe. I've given you exact information on what to do. And that's what Italian emergency services are likely to do, possibly not with the same wording. But did you understand me unless you spoke Italian? The presumption is not. If you do, and if you did, please come and talk to me. I really want to listen to you. In the project Interact, that is what is supporting our research on risk communication and multilingual crisis, we are trying to understand exactly this. Everybody agrees on some crucial points. Timely and accurate risk communication in crisis is essential. Everybody agrees that it saves lives and supports distribution of humanitarian aid. But it is also well known that communication fails, even when it is monolingual, even when we all share the same language. But what happens when we need to consider multilingual communication, when we need to consider cultural differences and the information needs to be provided in a culture-specific and language-specific way? Well, the general answer that we get, pictograms. We all understand pictures. They're a universal language. So besides the fact that these horrible pictograms has been designed by me and not by a professional designer, telling you what Interact is about in a nutshell is not necessarily telling you a lot about the project, and is not even using very effectively and efficiently different codes of figurative meaning and figurative language. So why do we expect to rely on pictograms when our life may depend on it? We could direct you to readings in medical emergencies, in medical pictograms, where they found out that pictograms don't really help patients on understanding dosage, usage, and they're not reliable. So the next question is, okay, so signs may be enough, maybe. This is a real one, it's not mine, I wish I knew the context. That's the other part. I wish I knew the context. Risk communication depends on the context. You don't just need to know the risk that you're facing, but how the society that surrounds you deals with those risks, how the local vulnerabilities are considered in terms of being prepared to face them, to deal with them. So maybe if I knew where you're able normally to breathe underwater, this sign would make more sense to me. So that's where translation and translators come in. And for those of you who are particularly interested in semantics, as I am, I do apologize. I'm using definitions very loosely. I know that the audience comes from different disciplines. I should have meant to define crisis, what we mean by crisis. I do remember that there are approximately 300 definitions of disasters, and probably in crisis communication you find an equivalent number of definitions of crisis and crisis communication. Let's say that those are disruption to the ordinary. For the sake of facilitating today, I'm presuming that they require responders, possibly from abroad. In this case, they are Japanese responders in New Zealand. They require emergency services. There are likely to be medical emergencies. There are likely to be other sorts of emergencies. And those crises can be triggered by natural hazards, but they can also be triggered by technological issues. They can be triggered by humans. So that's why crisis is chosen as the term of reference here. But in terms of emergencies and the crises that have created those emergencies, we generate a number of messages in different forms. Mobile phone messages, written documents, leaflets, video, radio announcements, pictograms. Yes, we do use them. And in this context, translation really refers to all of these modes. For those of you who might be linguists, you know that there are very clear distinctions between the translators of the oral messages, interpreters, including sign interpreters, and the translators of written messages. But in terms of crisis, these definitions really often do not matter. But they do matter in terms of quality. What would you like to have as your medical expert to your side? Somebody who's a specialist in what you're suffering from, or somebody who's a general practitioner. So they do matter and they don't matter. So drop, cover and hold. Famously, this is a very memorable way of being reactive in case of an earthquake in New Zealand. But apparently, if you don't come from an Anglophone country, and if you're old, you're not understanding that drop doesn't mean dropping because you fall, because you're old, and because you're vulnerable to the event. It doesn't connect the message with the action. So maybe translation is useful there. That's where I want to suggest that language translation in this sense, whatever form it takes, really matters in crisis. So let me give you another example. And I move you to Japan. Any Japanese speaker in the audience? Excellent. So we got somebody to help us.
国会中継の途中ですが、地震津波関連の情報をお伝えします。今、東京のスタジオも揺れています。東京のスタジオも揺れています。緊急地震速報が出ました。宮城県、岩手県、福島県、秋田県、山形県に緊急地震速報です。また、今、東京渋谷のスタジオも揺れを感じています。東京渋谷のスタジオも揺れています。強い揺れを観測した地域の皆さんにお伝えします。落ち着いて行動してください。揺れが収まってから。
What do I have to do? So this was a message, a warning message on official television with information of geographical nature on what to do. And I happen to be a business person on a business trip, and I'm staying in a hotel without my interpreter. I don't speak Japanese. It's the 11th of March 2011, and my hotel is in Fukushima. What do I have to do? I've listened to this warning message. Now, this is not just a situation, it's an authentic scenario. There were over 20,000 speakers of languages that could rely on English translations for the Japanese messages who didn't have any access to the Japanese information during the evacuation phase for the tsunami. There were more than 1.2 million non-speakers of Japanese in Japan during this emergency. What do you do if you don't have the interpreter there? If your language is basic enough to have a conversation over a meal, but not necessary to understand what you've got to do? Well, at the time, the solution was community of translators and interpreters and subtitlers, people that are not normally professionals, put together resources within 48 and 72 hours to support at least those who spoke English at some level to understand what the warnings were about. But could you trust somebody who's not a professional? Could you trust the message has been translated from a language that you don't understand by people that you don't trust because maybe they're not good translators, maybe they don't do that, and their English may be somewhat challenging?
おはようございます。6時になりました。NHK ニュースおはよう日本です。
緊急地震速報です。強い揺れに警戒してください。緊急地震速報です。強い揺れに警戒してください。
緊急地震速報です。福島県、宮城県、山形県、茨城県、栃木県では強い揺れに警戒してください。テレビの画面は福島県いわき市の現在の様子です。カメラが左右に揺れています。NHK の各放送局からの情報によりますと、先ほど午前6時ごろ、東北地方で揺れを感じました。
Do we know what to do? We have enough information to know which prefectures to avoid. We know which regions should be avoided because of the tsunami alarm. So maybe the subtitles are not, the most sophisticated forms of translations in English, but we know what to avoid at a basic level. And this was a real warning from 2016. Now, I couldn't quite place whether the subtitling was being done live, so with a form of either re-speaking or using a machine translation system that automatically translates the sound and makes the spoken language into written subtitles. And some of you might have used this on YouTube. You can create automatic subtitles. The quality is doubtable. So I am kind of getting to the point where I'm understanding crucial information that is essential for me to act. This is a big natural disaster. Of course, this is far away from us. This is not the UK. And it cannot happen here. I'm very much okay here. So much so that the Secretary of State, and I'm not naming names, a few years back, and he was responsible at the time for the Department of Communities and Local Government, and he said that translating leaflets and documents out of English was a problem, as it led to an unintentional adverse impact on integration by reducing the incentive for some migrant communities to learn English. So, of course, those migrant communities also include everybody who comes to the UK for business with their interpreters and go to Nissan and Toshiba and have business meetings with a Japanese interpreter. Those kind of incentives to learn English also apply to tourists who come for a week. Of course, when I go to Finland, I learn Finnish so that I could stay for a week there for my holidays. And so the language barrier is there. Now, interestingly enough, and many colleagues in the audience I recognize, and I know that you know a lot more than me about this, but the guys that run the Secretary of State runs exactly that department that oversees the emergency plans for the UK. So it's somebody that should be, in fact, quite aware of how multilingual Britain can be. But of course, this doesn't apply to maybe large emergencies, we would say. We don't have tsunamis, we don't have floods. And if we look at the law, which is what within Interact we're doing, we're looking at the law, we looked at what the Civil Contingency Act suggests in terms of protecting vulnerable communities. And officially, according to the law, those who don't speak English confidently and proficiently are vulnerable. And the suggestion is that then the statute of the law, it's actioned through policies. So we look at the emergency response and recovery policies, and I analyzed it. I tried to look at what it says about translators, interpreters, and of course the big national policies then depend on the application at local level, blah, 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 blah. There's a very clear scenario. Within 24 hours or 48 hours, if you live in the UK and you don't speak English, you're entitled as a vulnerable group to find in your humanitarian reception center information in a language that you can access. That could be sign language for British speakers of sign language, but it could also be any other language. So this particular column is taken by the human aspects of emergency management, the guidance on supporting individuals. So this is real guidance, what you should be doing. Now, some of you might remember that on the 14th of June 2017, the Grenfell Tower suffered an enormous tragedy. In England, in a monolingual country speaking predominantly English, but well known, especially from the perspective of the European Union, as being one of the countries in which most languages are spoken daily. In London, they presume that around 340 languages are used only in London every day. And that challenges, of course, resources for the police, for all the emergency responders. So what was the accessible information for those who didn't speak English? Because there were people who didn't speak English in the Grenfell Tower. Well, there's all sorts. We've already said you can have leaflets, and there were leaflets. There's the website of the government. There are radio messages. There were only partial radio messages. And some of the information in translation was about recovery support after the Grenfell fire. Was it translated within 48 hours? No, within 24 hours. Was it translated by the government? Well, if you look at the website, that is the website for support to the Grenfell Tower victims, on the 16th of June, so 2 days after the event, 48 hours after the event, says the foreign nationals If you're a foreign national, go and contact your embassy. Okay, but what if you are a resident in the UK and not necessarily in position to contact your embassy? You're a refugee. You need to wait just until the 22nd of July to have essential information about accommodation, relocation, and facilities. Was it translated according to the emergency preparedness plan of the Cabinet Office? No, it was translated by an international NGO, Translators Without Borders, the same one that supports international crisis with languages that are languages of minorities, languages of minor diffusion, etc. So the translations and the interpreting also needed in London were supported by NGOs. Now, I feel a bit uncomfortable with that, especially connecting it with the emergency preparedness plans, but possibly it's my ignorance. I'm Italian, I don't know emergency planning very well, and maybe that part is not relevant. So I'm also a bit of a linguist, and I know, as many of you do, that there is a very effective way of getting information about the local population. Okay, the 2011 census may be a little bit too old, but in April 2017, everybody was checked, every household in the UK was checked for the languages spoken just before the elections. Plus, some of the people living in the Grenfell Tower had been located there, given accommodation there by social services through the help and support of interpreters. So suddenly, their language needs that are there in ordinary conditions are no longer necessary. So my big question is, could they have been predicted? Could we have thought of translation in this crisis? Well, it can be scapegoated, as usual. And in fact, the watch manager of North Kensington was asked a number of questions a year later after the Grenfell Tower inquiry, and the second one asked by the inquiry was whether he investigated if there were people in the block whose grasp of English potentially obstructed the evacuation advice in place. So language as an obstruction, language as a barrier. So we cannot translate leaflets, we cannot have interpreters and translators interfering because that stops us from integrating migrants into the UK. But then when they obstruct the work of emergency responders, when they put in danger both the firefighters and the other residents, could we have done with a little bit more knowledge of what was required? In some cases, it's just a couple of code words. I'm not suggesting that in these situations you can have a full interpreter around, but it takes very little to trust the information you are receiving. So one of the other questions that you would have asked me had you had the chance of participating with the system working, which is refusing to do today, is why we have a lot of technology. Why don't we use it? It's been used for at least 3 decades. The full interpreter translator, there you have it. Well, maybe it's not available at the moment, somewhere in another galaxy, but this one is in your Skype. Skype Professional, Skype for other users, has a built-in interpreter for several languages, many more are being added, allows you to speak to another person through your own language, and the conversation is then subtitled for you, live. Does it work? Well, all translation technologies are getting very powerful. Some of you might have used Google Translate just to get a grasp of information in another language. And of course, they are getting very powerful, and there's a lot of hype around artificial intelligence behind these technologies. And they do work to some extent. I'm not sure that primary responders in the UK, such as the NHS, should recommend us to use Google Translate, but they do. And it's a very reliable source. So Italian is a gendered language. Sorry, this is 5 minutes of Italian language for you. Italian is a gendered language. Those adjectives that end in O are masculine. The ones that end in E are masculine and feminine. The ones that end in A are feminine only. So I said, Google Translate, help me. I'm smart, and I'm clearly beautiful. But I'm beautiful but not smart. So if I'm a man, I'm smart, and I'm also good looking. But then suddenly I become a woman to be good looking but stupid. So they might be artificial intelligence, but they do have the human bias. very clearly built in. So the intelligence may be artificial, but the bias is very much human. Now, this has been studied quite effectively by colleagues at Dublin City University, and it does this kind of mistakes regularly for all the languages that use gender. It does use statistical systems, etc., etc. So essentially, this kind of technologies are somewhat reliable, but they also come with all the bias of the worst possible translators and interpreters. So I do have a bit of a problem there, but then you could say, well, of course you have a problem. You train translators. You're going to lose your job if these guys can do better than you. Of course, but I think that in terms of translation and interpreting, the issue of supporting risk communication in crisis cuts across a number of crises, cuts across a number of language combinations that go beyond the professional and non-professional. Sometimes you don't have the professionals because some language combinations don't have a market. Who wants to translate between Finnish and the logo? There isn't a need. So nobody is trained to do that. So maybe I'll skip this one, and we might get back to that if you're interested later on. But the suggestion is that your emergencies in a different language may be somewhat predictable. They may be totally unpredictable, as it was this one. But if they are predictable, then maybe providing information that people trust because they understand it clearly is quite important. So this is what the governor of Florida did in 2017 when explaining the Miami evacuation plan.
Hurricane Irma ya ha estado impactando nuestro estado. Este huracán es muy peligroso. Acuérdense que la vida de usted y su familia es lo más importante. Por favor, tengan cuidado. Cada familia ya debe de estar en un sitio seguro. Para más información, por favor, llamen a 1-800-34-23557. También visitan mi cuenta de Twitter a FLGovScott para más información en inglés y español de Huracán Irma.
Okay, so I could recognize the sound of the Spanish speakers in the room because it's a very good Spanish speaker. I mean, I don't speak Spanish enough to reproduce the sound as well as he does, but it is quite cringeworthy as it sounds to a linguist. Now, the message is there, it's been translated, so there is an element of preparedness, and it's being conveyed in Spanish. You do have a sign language interpreter next to the governor, because maybe he cannot sign as well as he speaks Spanish. The fact, though, is why don't we rely on the Spanish speakers there? Are they not important in all of this? Miami has 77% of the population that doesn't speak English as the first language. So it's quite multilingual. And the United States, in a sense, have been quite prepared. So to come to the final part of my brief introduction to where you find translation in crisis, of course you find a lot of focus and emphasis on translation and translation of risk communication messages in the work done by international humanitarian aid organizations. So recently, in 2016, they agreed what is called the Grand Bargain commitment to collaborating with communities affected by disasters, communities affected by crisis, and engaging with them directly. So for them, the idea of language was crucial, because to engage with a community, you cannot go there and expect them to speak and use the lingua franca. You don't create that bridge of trust that is necessary to share information efficiently. And in fact, a report that came out in December from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies says that we still don't have enough data to prove how little effective is this presumption that the lingua franca will be okay, will be universally understood, and will be enough to communicate. So we run and this is where I finish before we can take questions, we ran a set of interviews with a number of organizations. And it's a sample, but those were all risk communication officers for the World Health Organizations, for Oxfam, for the Communicating with Disaster Affected Communities Network, with the International Red Cross and Crescent, several representatives across a number of societies. And all of them agreed that providing language access is fundamentally important to humanitarian operations, but at present there is limited capacity to formalize it. So it's not in emergency plan, is not in preparedness plans as well embedded as it should. They say it cuts across. It's for everybody. It's an issue, and this term, cuts across. Cuts across was in all the interviews as if they'd agreed. So language issues cut across every aspect of these international organizations, but accommodating language needs, although necessary, is incredibly difficult. And even if it makes them more accountable to the community they're supporting, is still a challenge. They see it as a complex task, and they see that language access capabilities may go beyond budget, staff resources. But the fact is, budget is always hiding the fact that nobody wants to say, take ownership for the problem. Somebody who says, I have leadership on trying to find a solution. And one interesting point was everybody has to have ownership because it matters for every part of our organizations. Everybody has ownership means nobody has ownership. Nobody checks it. That's the risk. But at the same time, it was very interesting how the World Health Organization communication officer suggested that communicate is to listen to people's concern, is to address their concern, to know what they're thinking about. It's important to speak their language, to speak the same language, of course, through a mediation, in this case, an interpreter or a translator, so that it's a critical point of understanding and trust is established. So my 3 points today were those. I have plenty of ways to answer your questions, and if you want more data, I have plenty of data to share with you. But I tried to keep to time, not very successfully. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Federico, for sorting it out. And I loved your presentation. I think it's something that can help us in everyday life, including intercultural relations, where translation plays a very substantial part of every aspect of what we're doing in cities like London, and in particular in a multicultural environment like UCL. So is there any question for the next one? David? Well, wait a second, the microphone, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Tante grazie per il discorso. Where are we going? Are we going up, down, backwards? Are we staying where we are? Are things improving? Are they getting worse? Or are they static at the moment, translation-wise, in crisis?
I think the short answer is, and this comes after a lot of efforts trying to catch up with the literature in disaster science, there's a lot more awareness that this is a problem. Some very interesting articles that put their fingers onto this problem realize that it's not just a question of translating, but translating appropriately. So where are we going? We're going 2 steps backwards, 1 step forward. There's new apps produced, generated every time, but are apps the right solution? One interesting example was how the storm surge of the 2013 typhoon in the Philippines was translated as an accurate translation of the scientific term storm surge, whilst the Filipino language would have needed a definition more likely to sound like a tsunami wave of catastrophic proportions. 4,500 people didn't evacuate and died. Now those are just 2 terms. That is not a translation problem. That's an awareness and translation problem. So we're going possibly up because 3 reports in 2018 have suggested that translation is still a problem. Those reports that assess progress in terms of community engagement still give us an oblique understanding that out of the Great Bargains commitments that are linked to the Sendai framework for risk reduction, those areas in which progress is very slow are areas of community engagement. You link community engagement with translation, and you realize that without a language in common, you're not progressing. Long answer. for a short question, sorry.
I think we have time for a short last question. Part two, maybe.
Have you ever considered that icons is also a language that needs to be taught? At the beginning, you made instruction, you tell instruction about evocation, and I did understand that, even it was Italian, because I was trained on that. But regular people, I mean, in poor countries, don't even understand what is a safe point. Yeah. But language, icon language, could be taught also.
Yeah, that's another aspect. Education, to whatever language might work, to whatever system might work. But it doesn't need an education, so it still needs time. That's why pictograms may be useful if everybody agrees on conventionalized pictograms, but we don't. So that's just another lingua franca replacing an oral lingua franca. We do have also another range of issues. Literacy. You cannot translate written text with written text if your audience is not literate. So often we're talking about what you would call multimodal forms of translations. You take a written text, you translate it in another written form, but then it's being broadcast orally in the radio, or maybe somebody out of the community reads that text aloud to people who are illiterate. And we've done a little experiment in New Zealand where they built in on an emergency preparedness guide 16 different languages to share with the 16 linguistic communities that have so far remained excluded from emergency preparedness activities in New Zealand. And what they did, they created citizen translators that would use their text within the community. So it's not just the text, but it's a human being that goes there and explains and uses the text within the community. So yeah, education, be it with signs or pictograms or with language, is an important part.
Hi, thank you very much for the very interesting lecture. I'm going to take it out a bit from the language field and bring it to the health field. When I think about global health, not only in developing countries and humanitarian crisis, but also in the UK, where, for example, people cannot have access to the NHS. They cannot, for example, register with a GP because all the forms to fill are in English and the receptionist only speaks English. And also for international organization where all the staff being deployed in humanitarian crisis speak English or have very poor cultural understanding of the second language they will speak. So in one of the last slides, the international NGOs were mentioning staff capacity and lack of resources. I'm quite puzzled and I have a hard time understanding if it's really a lack of capacity and resources or if there is in some instance, maybe a lack of will as well to kind of challenge these barriers that are putting people's life at risk. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. What is capacity in this sense? We're not talking about huge investment. Translation doesn't cost as much as many other forms of preparedness, especially to respond to natural disasters. But we had the example of the Western Africa Ebola crisis in 2014, which was a waking up point for the World Health Organization. They did loads of translations in lingua francas that simply didn't work in the West African countries that they were using them for. So Translators Without Borders and colleagues at Dublin City University that lead the Interact team ran an experiment on understanding how far you can go with explaining medical information of simple nature, avoid the contagion of Ebola, through a written leaflet. So the Kenyan government supported this because they were afraid that the contagion could move eastwards. And so they produced a very beautiful leaflet in English. And 23% of the people that read it after a week remembered how to avoid the contagion. And they produced a version in Kiswahili, which is spoken and read by the vast majority of the population in the area. And surprise, surprise, 79% of the population, a week after they read the leaflet, still remembered how to avoid the contagion. The language matters. So yes, in medical terms, it's been proven over and over. And there are studies as early as 1990s in the USA healthcare systems that actually try to put a number in terms of morbidity and casualties and fatal events in emergency rooms that could have been avoided with better communications with either patients or relatives. Because that's the other part. In healthcare and medical translation, medical areas, often the interpreter or translator is a family member, which opens an entire different kind of issues, especially the young family members. And there's colleagues at the Institute of Education that studied how language brokers of very young age go and have medical examinations with the grandparents, grandmothers, and there's issues with gender, there's issues with communication. So yeah, the medical translation within a crisis and risk reduction is a kind of worm, and in ordinary terms, and it's in fact one of the largest areas of investment in terms of translation in the UK, because of interpreting for the NHS, interpreting for, and translations of leaflets for the NHS.
Thank you very much for your answers, and thanks to you, many thanks to you for all your questions. I think right now the time is over, and thanks again for attending. Thanks to you for your talk, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.